Oh, by the way, I made a Subscribe Star page. The link to it will be in the description down below. I've added a few reward tiers that I'm hoping you might find intriguing. Some examples include access to new videos up to 48 hours before release, helping to choose topics, getting credited in future videos, and a private stream. And okay, on to the video. Western versus Eastern storytelling. What's the difference? Oh. Television, comics, novels, video games, modern cinema, one might think differences between writers and the stories they tell would rest on the typical factors often spewed out by critics: pacing, plotting, characterization, etc. But even the average audience participant likely can't help but notice a clear and distinct difference between Western and Eastern media. Differences so distinct, in fact, that they've created their own niches amongst consumers. Probably three of the most recognizable of these niches in the West are anime fandoms, kung fu enthusiasts, and the J-horror lovers. While it's true that all three are industries like comics or animated television shows are here in the West, each tends to be separate from the general consumer and each tends to appeal only to a certain demographic. But why? Even when a piece of Eastern media manages to break into the Western mainstream and attain mass appeal from general audiences, these works are distinctly different from the media produced in the West. Yet when you break it down, both tend to utilize the same tropes, a word which here means a significant or reoccurring theme or motif. For example, we can see with movies like Lord of the Rings and The Sorcerer and the White Snake that Western fantasies are just as likely to have brave warriors battling monstrous entities as Eastern fantasies. And we can see from the Hunger Games and Battle Royale or the likes of Apocalypto and the War of the Arrows that we even have similar media with similar premises. Yet, still the differences remain highly apparent. So, what is it that makes Eastern storytelling so noticeably different from Western storytelling? On the surface, there are several notable differences. Let's take a look at two works that help create the foundations of each style: The Odyssey and The Journey to the West. Each work involves a central protagonist embarking on a quest. Each quest involves a long, arduous journey with plenty of interesting adventures, and each work involves heavy divine intervention. The Odyssey's quarrelsome Greek gods and The Journey to the West's rather numerous heavenly deities. The first major difference is also probably the most recognizable and can be summed up in one word: nakama. Nakama is a term that usually tags along with Japanese anime. In short, this refers to the group that the main character usually leads. For example, in the show Dragon Ball Z, Son Goku would be the hero and the Z fighters would be his nakama. Another example would be Goblin Slayer, where the title character would be the leader and the priestess, high elf, archer, lizard priest, and dwarf shaman would be his nakama. In Journey to the West, the main character is the great monk Tripitaka, aka Tang Xuanchang, with Sun Wukong the Monkey King, Pigsy the greedy pig monster, and Sandy the mischievous river spirit being his nakama. Now, it could be technically argued that the Odyssey's leading man, Odysseus, has a nakama too, since he is the leader of a great many soldiers. And I suppose that would be technically correct, given that despite the belief that nakama refers to a group of close friends, culturally, it's more accurate to describe a nakama as a group of people working together to accomplish the same goal. So, in essence, a squad of soldiers would be nakama to one another, and so Odysseus's men could count as his nakama too. However, here's why that wouldn't fit. Narratively speaking, each member of a nakama is special and unique. They tend to have skills and fleshed out personalities that either support or contrast with the lead character. So, more than a crew of nameless soldiers. They tend to fall into a trope called the five-man band. While the archetypes and number may vary, the core members are the leader, the lancer, the smart guy, the big guy, and the chick, or the heart if you want to be more politically correct and boring, and you're the type of person people tend to ignore at parties. The leader is the main hero, the lancer is the hero's contrast, the smart guy is in charge of knowing things, the big guy is of course the team's muscle, and the chick helps keep the balance, quelling aggression, keeping up morale, and making sure the team stays together. Now compare this to the Odyssey, where Odysseus has a following of soldiers, but no special companions. It's just Odysseus alone, with a group of men who follow him out of sworn duty rather than a sense of companionship or rivalry. In fact, by the end, Odysseus is alone, having lost all of his men, but their loss losses are treated more like ways to ramp up the sense of danger for Odysseus, rather than for character drama. In contrast, the loss of even one member in Journey to the West would be a heartbreaking experience. The audience develops a special connection to members of a nakama because they tend to be fully developed characters, while the only one in the Odyssey meant for the audience to connect with is Odysseus. The second biggest is probably a lesser-known trope, but likely still recognizable to the anime faithful: enemies becoming companions. Dragon Ball Z and even the original Dragon Ball are famous for this, since most of Goku's friends were enemies at one time. Even his first friend, Bulma, introduced herself by shooting Goku in the face, but this is also a fairly common trope. The series Yu Yu Hakusho has Yusuke Urameshi team up with two demons, Hiei and Kurama, two demons he previously battled. He also teams up with longtime school rival Kuwabara, and yes, this trope also exists in Journey to the West. Tripitaka gets Monkey King as a freebie, but Pigsy and Sandy start off as enemies when Monkey and Tripitaka first encounter them. It's only after a vicious battle and some divine intervention that these enemies eventually become companions. Now contrast this to the Odyssey. Odysseus encounters many enemies throughout his long journey home, but none of those enemies become his companion. As is common with Western protagonists, Odysseus remains the lone hero, with tertiary characters existing for a singular purpose or treated more like fodder for drama and tension. There's never a part where Odysseus fights and befriends a Lotus Eater, and Polyphemus doesn't become Odysseus' rival only to join forces later to escape the clutches of Charybdis, and Circe doesn't become the spunky magical girl who constantly insults Odysseus while secretly pining for him. It just doesn't happen. And these appear to be two distinct differences between how Western creatives write and how Eastern creatives write. However, neither difference is unique to Eastern writing. Most Western television shows have a cast of characters surrounding a main lead. For example, Scrubs, the medical dramedy, stars Dr. John Dorian, who is then supported by a colorful cast of characters with intriguing personalities. While one might not classify their relationship as nakama per se, other Western shows like 24 and NCIS have their respective casts fall securely beneath the nakama umbrella. The Expendables trilogy is a perfect example of nakama appearing in Western media, with Barney Ross acting as a lead and the remaining cast acting as his nakama. Also, old enemies becoming companions isn't exactly unique to Eastern media either, at least not anymore, with one of the coolest examples being Deckard Shaw from the Fast and Furious series, a Western-born movie franchise. Shaw entered the scene as an antagonist, but later allied himself with the main crew. The movie Hobbs and Shaw wouldn't have been possible without the essential change of heart. But if tropes like these don't make the definitive difference between the two styles, then what does? The answer might be found in the difference between cultural philosophies. But what does that mean exactly? Well, because storytelling has changed and evolved over the centuries, it could mean a number of things. For example, a good place to look for modern differences would arguably be Death Note. On one hand, the original anime/manga series is so respected and adored due to its intriguing concept, clever writing, and powerful characterization that it became one of the few Japanese works to skyrocket into the American mainstream. On the other hand, due to its popularity, we now have a Western adaptation thanks to Netflix. Now, quality aside, there were some significant changes done to Death Note's story that gave the film a distinctly American feel. Even if I were to compare the Netflix live-action movie to the Japanese live-action version of Death Note, a viewer might still notice that one film has a more American Western structure, and the other is more noticeably Japanese. And yes, that's regardless of cinematography or the fact that the actors are clearly speaking different languages. One of the first noticeable differences is how the two cultures seem to portray smart protagonists. The character of Light Yagami in the Japanese version, is defined by his high intelligence. And the same could technically be said for the Netflix's version of Light Turner for Western audiences. But that's where things change lanes into common American cliché. See, when it comes to intelligent high school protagonists in Western media, there seems to be only one dedicated mold: the awkward nerd. Netflix's Light Turner was considered highly intelligent, at least by the movie's standards, but he was portrayed in the only fashion modern Western writers can portray a smart high school protagonist. He's physically weak, he's socially awkward, he's a coward who eagerly walks away from his ambitions the moment things get tough. He acts out of submission, wanting to give people what they want, rather than acting out of dominance, working to impose his will on the world and recreate it in his own image, and he's willing to throw all caution to the wind because a girl paid him the slightest bit of attention. They are commonly written without masculine traits or any sense of real confidence. In comparison, modern Japanese works allow smart protagonists to fall into several molds. One might point out the reclusively ugly super nerds, also referred to as NEETs, not in education, employment, or training, a very lowly person in Japanese society. While these characters may be nerdy when pertaining to their standard obsession with some form of chosen media, their reservoir of knowledge and the height of their intelligence is usually relegated to their said obsessions. In other words, they aren't necessarily smart and are often even characterized as foolish or stupid for wasting their lives and not working to achieve their potential. The next kind is the brainy nerd. These types are usually lacking in muscle but are hyper-competent in various technical skills. They are usually accompanied by a device like a laptop or a robot. This category of intelligent protagonist is pretty close to the American high school nerd archetype. Knowledgeable, likely has good grades, and eagerness to please, socially awkward, and not particularly handsome or beautiful. Though they are prone to being portrayed as cute, if you're into that sort of thing. So in short, this is where Light Turner would likely be sorted, except without the hyper-competence. Light Yagami would fall under this next category, the top student. I'll come back to this in a bit, but in Western media, the popular kids are often stereotyped as athletes and cheerleaders, and they maintain their popularity through sheer physical achievement. They're not necessarily smart. In fact, they're quite often portrayed as exceptionally stupid. But in Japanese media, the most popular student tends to be the top overachiever. The student who makes the top grades is a ranking member of the student council, while also being athletic, has some level of social competence, and is physically attractive. So Light Yagami isn't alone here. He's joined by the likes of Kurama from Yu Yu Hakusho, Seto Kaiba from Yu-Gi-Oh!, Angel from Angel Beats, and pretty much every guy who's ever dramatically pushed up his glasses. To summarize, Light Turner's intelligence places him on the bottom of the social ladder in Western society, while Light Yagami's intelligence places him at the top of Eastern society. Why might that be? This specific example is only surface level, but I wanted to point it out because it also feeds right back into a core philosophical difference between the East and the West. To better illustrate what I mean, let's move away from Japanese media and head right back to the arena of Chinese cinema. In the sequel to Ip Man, our hero faces off against a monstrous British boxer named Twister. Ip Man uses the style and finesse of Wing Chun against Twister's aggressive boxing techniques and overwhelming brute strength. This match perfectly highlights a root difference between the philosophy of the West and the philosophy of the East. And this match between Ip Man and Twister is not an isolated event. A similar match takes place in Jet Li's Fearless, a somewhat historical movie which follows the story of martial arts legend Hu Yongjia. He eventually faces off against a Western fighter called Hercules O'Brien. And again, just like with Ip Man, Hu Yongjia must use the skill and finesse of Wushu to defeat the overwhelming power of O'Brien's sheer brute force. And this difference isn't just relegated to movies, it's consistent with historical events as well. One of the most notable events being the arrival of the Black Ships. The Black Ships were actually an attempt by the United States to once again open trade with Japan after over 200 years of relative isolation. Politics and reasons aside, this code of isolation left Japan to its own ends, which meant it was left with its status quo of tradition. Perry's arrival was so earth-shattering because with him came great technological advancements and the unyielding muscle of industry. The arrival of Western influence was such a sharp and crucial change for Japan that it would help spark a war between the shogunate and its desire to preserve tradition and the imperial loyalists with their desire for change. So how does this all fit together? In the West, Light Turner's intelligence placed him at the bottom of the social ladder, while athletes and cheerleaders are typically placed at the top due to physical achievement. In the East, Light Yagami's intelligence alone earns him respect, raising his status on the social ladder, keeping in mind that his physical capabilities, tennis and fighting, are only really showcased once each throughout this series. From what we see in how the other students and adults revere Light, most of his popularity stems from his intellect. When Ip Man and Hu Yongjia face off against the Western fighters, it's a battle involving the spiritual discipline of Chinese martial arts versus the physical discipline of Western boxing. Also note that the greatest Eastern fighters are often portrayed as gurus gurus, respected more for the wisdom they gained through their practice of martial arts, while the greatest Western fighters are portrayed as skilled athletes, respected for their physical capabilities, with intelligence and wisdom being a bonus if present at all. And if anyone has seen Fearless, Huo Yanjie was a great fighter, but only delivered the change to the world that would make him a legend after achieving spiritual harmony, aka achieving enlightenment. This calls back to the ideals of Buddhism and Confucianism, both religions that heavily influence the East and which both center around finding one's personal path to enlightenment or adhering to ideals such as humaneness and filial piety. You see hints of this when looking back at kung fu movies. Mastering martial arts isn't really the goal, it's more of a vehicle towards self-improvement, a way to balance one's mind and body. Now compare this to Catholicism, a religion that dominated the West. While self-improvement is also a goal, in the center lies a central conflict in the form of hell and Satan, the eternal adversary, who cheats at cards. One is driven to do good with the consequence of eternal damnation and torture should they fail to resist Satan's constant temptations. Now compare the Eastern philosophy to the American action movie, where main characters use combat, gunplay, and the occasional car fu to squash the bad guy. Whatever happens over the course of the movie, whatever the main character goes through, everything is done to come out as the dominant force in the story's overarching issue, to stop the terrorist, to save the beautiful damsel, to get revenge against the guy who killed your dog. But again, what does this all mean exactly? And more importantly, what does this all have to do with storytelling? One of the core differences between a Western story and an Eastern story is how the West and the East view the role of conflict. Let's go back to the Odyssey and Journey to the West. The Odyssey is the story of Odysseus overcoming various obstacles to eventually return home before the suitors steal away both his wife and his entire kingdom. In the Journey to the West, the journey being referred to in the title isn't a journey to defeat a great enemy, rescue damsels, or topple an empire. The journey is a pilgrimage begun by Buddha to deliver his sutras to the land of the South, aka Tang China, where the people have become greedy and hedonistic. While that might sound like a pressing conflict, the story doesn't present it as one. These people may have grown sinful, but they aren't holding anyone hostage. They aren't trying to carry out a nefarious plot that puts a timer on the heroes. There's not an evil ancient prophecy foretelling some great calamity that will befall the world if these people don't receive the teachings of Buddha. It was just an instance of Buddha seeing some troubled people and wanting to rectify that. In other words, there is an overarching problem, but no overarching conflict. The structure developed by the German novelist Gustav Freytag, now known as Freytag's Triangle, is one of the most recognizable structures for Western storytelling. It begins with exposition to set the scene, then an incident to spark the story's conflict, then we're led to the rising action, a complication, then we reach the story's climax, then a reversal of fortune followed by the falling action as the conflict dies down, leading finally to denouement. Now let's look at one of the most recognizable Eastern storytelling structures, Kisho Tenketsu. Western and Eastern stories feel so different from each other because it isn't just about what tropes they use or how they develop their characters. They are written with completely different techniques and are different right down to the foundation. And this difference has become more blatant as each style developed over time, with emphasis on physical capability and or aggression being the top valued traits in Western heroes, traits that are well suited for the Western story structure. Kisho Tenketsu is a 4-part structure. Ki, the introduction, paints the setting. Sho, development, a part that provides a small change and adds detail which leads into the next act. 10, the twist, a major unexpected development. This is where the climax would be. Finally, Ketsu, the conclusion. This is where any dangling plots are tied up and the story heads towards its ending. Here's a quick example. Ki, introduction. A father finds that his family needs more food and goes out to the grocery store. Sho, development. Wife tells him to take a can of pepper spray since it is a dangerous neighborhood at night. 10, twist. Father returns home to find family murdered. Ketsu, conclusion. Father finds killer still in the house, pepper sprays his eyes, and manages to defeat him. The last shot ends with the police arriving. Not the happiest of stories, but while there are things that appear like evidence of a central conflict, if you look closely, there isn't one. Here's how this story might go if you told it using Freytag's Triangle, or adapting it for a Western audience. Exposition, introduce the family, the father, and the bad neighborhood setting. Inciting incident, the electricity goes out. Rising action, father hears his wife scream followed by a gunshot. Complication, wife is murdered by an intruder. Children have been taken hostage. Man is a loan shark come to steal enough money to repay a loan the wife had taken out without the father's knowledge. Climax, Father faces off against the intruder while trying to keep children alive. Reversal of fortune. One child gets shot, possibly dies. Falling action. Father summons the last bit of his strength to finally overpower the intruder, gets the gun, and shoots the man in the head. Denouement. Intruder is dead, the police arrive, the child who was shot is taken to the hospital for possible recovery, and the story ends with the sun rising while the father and the remaining child look on. Western plots are built off a central conflict, whether it be in fighting off a home invader, trying to romance a special someone before they're arranged to be married, or trying to find that perfect summer adventure before school starts next week. In other words, the pacing and overall structure tend to be far more aggressive than the Eastern structure, and this is a tradition that hails back to the plays of ancient Greece. The structure of a Greek tragedy was traditionally set in one place over the course of one day and set with one main plot, a formula perfectly portrayed by the infamous Oedipus Rex. Exposition. Chorus sings of Oedipus, king of Thebes, who defeated the Sphinx and married Jocasta, the widowed wife of the murdered king Laius. Now Thebes has been stricken by various misfortunes, a curse from the gods. Inciting incident. Creon, brother of Oedipus's wife Jocasta, returns from the Oracle of Delphi and delivers the gods' ultimatum that the misfortune of Thebes will continue until the murderer of Laius has been discovered and punished. Rising action. Tiresias, the blind prophet of Apollo, reluctantly reveals that Oedipus is both Laius's murderer and committing incest. Tensions grow between Creon and Oedipus since it was Creon who suggested that they listen to Tiresias in the first place. Jocasta explains that a prophet foretold that Laius was destined to die by his son, which didn't happen since she and Laius had their son killed. Coincidentally, there was a similar prophecy told that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. Laius was murdered near the Oracle of Delphi. She points this out to argue that prophets aren't always to be trusted. Oedipus unfortunately recognizes the location and begins to doubt his own innocence. Since the physically capable Oedipus happened to have killed a bunch of men at that exact spot around that exact time. Thing is, the surviving servant from the time said it was a group of robbers who killed Laius and not a single man. Then, to further discredit the power of prophecy, Polybus, Oedipus's father, has died of natural causes and not by the hand of Oedipus. At this time, Oedipus celebrates that the power of prophecy isn't as absolute as they once thought. Complication. Messenger reveals that Polybus and Merope are not Oedipus's parents, and that they took him in after a herdsman rescued him from the woods. Climax. Jocasta, knowing that Laius had left her son to die in those same woods, realizes that Oedipus was in fact her son. Reversal of fortune. Jocasta hangs herself. Falling action. Oedipus blinds himself and leaves Thebes in exile since he had indeed killed Laius, his father, and married Jocasta, his mother. Denouement. Oedipus goes into exile and Creon succeeds him as king. Neat and tidy. One day, one location, one plot stemming from one central conflict. So, how would the story of Oedipus Rex look if run through the Kisho Tenketsu formula? Step 1. Let's remove the central conflict from the equation, which means the plagues of Thebes are no longer in play. Key. Introduction. Oedipus is the respected king of Thebes after solving the riddle of the Sphinx. Life is good, despite Oedipus's dark, brooding past. Show. Development. Tiresias, blind prophet of Apollo, has passed, but in his dying words reveals that Laius, the previous king of Thebes, who people believe had been killed by robbers, was actually murdered by Oedipus. Oedipus rejects the accusation and vows to discover the true identity of Laius's murderer. Jocasta, once wife to Laius, now married to Oedipus, dismisses these concerns by saying that Laius was prophesied to be murdered by his son, but was killed by robbers. A messenger appears to deliver the news that King Polybus, father of Oedipus, has died. Oedipus is relieved because the credibility of prophecies have been challenged twice. One when Laius supposedly died at the hands of robbers, and then when King Polybus died of natural causes, since just as Laius was destined to die by his son, Oedipus was destined to kill his father Polybus. 10. Twist. Messenger reveals that Oedipus had been adopted by Polybus. Oedipus had been found in the woods. Jocasta and Laius had left their son to die in those same woods due to the prophecy. A surviving servant who had witnessed Laius's murder reveals that Laius was killed by a single man. At that same location, Oedipus had killed a group of men during the darkest times of his dark past. Every prophecy had come to pass. Oedipus had killed his father and married his mother. Ketsu. Conclusion. Jocasta hangs herself in shame, and Oedipus plucks out his eyes and flees into exile. Kisho Tenketsu is a writing structure absent of inherent conflict. While conflict can certainly be present in a story written in this style, it isn't necessary. In other words, this formula allows a writer to center the story around other elements. This is probably why the slice of life genre, where the topic of the story follows a character or characters as they go around an ordinary day, has more or less been dominated by anime and manga, and those trying to emulate its style. It might also be why the beach episode has become a well-known staple in anime culture, because when a central conflict exists as the absolute center of your story, every major element must connect to that conflict in some way. In effect, your characters, villains, twists, and turns become vehicles for the plot's progression. For example, the city of Thebes has been cursed by plague. How is this resolved? Terrorists have taken over a building filled with valuables in order to steal them. How is this resolved? An evil, oppressive empire has taken over the galaxy far, far away. How is this resolved? With the Kisho Tenketsu story structure, conflict, along with other elements, can become a vehicle for something else. A hero has devoted his life to slaying goblins, despite the job being lowly and beneath most adventurers. What drives a man to do this? A hero reaches power beyond measure and becomes a powerful anomaly within his own universe. How does he deal with this, and how does the world deal with him? A young prodigy finds a notebook that can kill anyone whose name is written inside. How does he react? Of course, it could be argued that each of these anime series has a deep central conflict, with Death Note reaching legendary status due to the driving cat-and-mouse conflict between Light and L. But what might happen if the central conflict were taken from Star Wars? The central conflict being that the Empire was an oppressive tyrannical force, whose constant push for absolute dominance in the galaxy caused them to create a superweapon known as the Death Star, and, in turn, caused the rebellion to steal plans of said Death Star, which caused the Empire to pursue the rebels, which caused the notable rebel agent Princess Leia to send a call for aid along with the Death Star plans to a small desert planet where an old ally lived, which then caused the Empire to destroy the home of Luke Skywalker, which pushed him into action. In other words, the central conflict in the original Star Wars is the tyranny of the Empire. Replace a tyrannical empire with a just one, and without the tyranny, any rebellion would likely be less powerful. It probably wouldn't build a powerful superweapon like the Death Star unless their hand had been forced by a dangerous hostile power. And without this conflict, Luke Skywalker may have lived out his days on a lonely desert planet. In short, the story falls apart. Now let's take a look at Death Note. The conflict that the series is known for involves the mental clash between the great detective L and Light Yagami, the killer with a god complex. But what would happen if L never existed? Light still takes possession of the Death Note, but there's no one in the world that could challenge its exceptional intellect. The story would definitely change, but the central premise would have been the same. What would a genius with a god complex do with the power of life and death? Light could have encountered faceless leaders of shadow governments. He could have gone up against terrorists organizations who used codenames, and the same goes for each listed example. Die Hard would be nothing without Hans Gruber's takeover of Nakatomi Tower, but Goblin Slayer's story could still exist without goblins, because in Goblin Slayer, the focus actually isn't the goblin slaying, it's the character of Goblin Slayer. It's the world they live in and how the world reacts when there's a hero like Goblin Slayer who doesn't idolize glory or gold, a hero who combats the troubles of the common people when he doesn't have to or can pursue greater things. That's the true story of Goblin Slayer. And despite the intriguing story of Oedipus, there would likely have been no story at all had the gods not cursed the land of Thebes. The plague sparked the investigations. The plagues brought Oedipus to force Tiresias' hand and spill his secrets. There would be no question to the murder of Laius, and Polybus's death would have simply been both a relief and a sad occasion for Oedipus, but no revelation or connection to the events of divine prophecy. The great tragedy would have likely never been realized. Again, the story would fall apart. And finally, the story of One Punch Man is not the conflict between his enemies or the self-absorbed elite heroes that inhabit the world. It's Saitama's own internal struggle, dealing with his power, his loss of humanity, and his place in the world. So, taking everything into account, maybe a more accurate description to expose the difference between these two styles wouldn't necessarily be that one has conflict and the other one doesn't, but rather Western stories are suited to explore the external struggle, while Eastern stories are suited to explore the internal struggle. And this isn't to say that one style is good and the other bad, and it isn't even to suggest that one structure is better than the other. And of course, there exists quite a bit of overlap, and there will always be exceptions to every norm. But when you look at the way Western and Eastern philosophies developed, and how their cultures developed around them, it becomes a little easier to see why creative works from the East feel so alien to an audience used to Western media, why popular Eastern properties are so often remade to suit a Western audience. We can explore an answer to the question, what were they changing in the first place? What's so different about a piece of media from halfway across the world? On the surface, they appear similar. They have heroes, villains, romances, and action like Western works do, but there also lies something exotic about the writing. Then you look at Eastern philosophies that emphasize internal struggles, and you look at the structure of Western religions, like Catholicism, and how one should always be ready for the external threat posed by an eternal adversary. The power of progress versus the respect for tradition, strength of body versus the strength of mind. Then you notice how powerful a role the development of culture and the respective worldviews of the East and West play into the development of a story. How writers write and what the audiences expect to see. Because in the end, from politics to our values to the stories we tell, our cultures and the differences therein broaden the possibilities of creativity beyond one simple guideline, or even the most powerful imagination. And that is a beautiful thing.